Micronesian leaders have warned the United States against further delaying congressional approval for federal funding arrangements to their respective countries. In a signed letter to Washington dated 6th of February, Whips Jr. of Palau, Hilda Heine of the Marshall Islands, and Wesley Simena of Micronesia said delays to approving their compacts of free association has opened their countries up to economic exploitation by competing political actors in the Pacific. RNZ Pacific's Marshall Islands correspondent Giff Johnson says the countries had anticipated being able to access the funding late last year. He spoke with Caleb Fotheringham, who began by asking how big of a problem this was for the Micronesian nations.
I think it's going to be a major issue for all three countries if the new funding agreements in the compacts for Palau, the FSM, and the Marshall Islands are not approved by the Congress. And right now they're languishing in the midst of just the general dysfunction of the U.S. Congress and its inability to pass legislation. There doesn't seem to be any particular opposition to the compacts. It's just they haven't found a legislative vehicle that they can get it through on. And so, like, for now, the Marshall Islands, the Marshall Islands was forced by the U.S. at the end of last year to dip into its trust fund, right? The first country to have to dip into its trust fund, which it shouldn't be touching for another 20 years. And so that's a problem long-term to do with the stability and the size of its trust fund in the future. But they got the money to use, right? So they're okay for now. Same with like the FSM and Palau. Everybody's on ongoing, like, same level funding from previous, but the fiscal year of the U.S. ends September 30, and Palau actually is in a little bit different situation because it has a bunch of loans that are due, and it was counting on compact bump up to manage its loan situation. So the longer it plays out in the U.S. Congress and doesn't get approved, yes, it's going to have financial repercussions on the islands. And I would say that's something that everybody has got to be concerned with out here.
When were the funding arrangements meant to start coming in?
Okay, so the previous 20-year funding arrangement expired September 30 last year. And the hope had been that these would be approved in time so that it could simply be adopted by the Congress, and it would be October 1 last year. Things would have just rolled into a new period. Now, despite the fact that Palau and the FSM signed off on their compacts back in May of last year, June, they were held up waiting for the Marshalls. The Marshalls had legitimate issues with the U.S. The U.S. government has not come to the table on the nuclear legacy. It's taken a terrible policy toward the Marshall Islands on the nuclear legacy. And I hope people in the Pacific region understand this, that the U.S. government is not playing ball with the Marshall Islands on its nuclear legacy. So there were a lot of things up in the air, and ultimately the Marshall Islands was pretty much backed into a corner and signed off in October with the agreement. And that delay came with the penalty that they were forced to dip into their trust fund. Instead of, like, FSM got a continuing resolution from the Congress. Continuing resolution meaning they just continued previous level funding in the new fiscal year to keep the island solvent. And Palau actually is on a different schedule. Their compact officially doesn't expire until the end of this year. So they're still in getting funding. It's just that there were changes made in the new agreements that obviously increased the value. And so everybody was counting on this. So again, the point being, the longer the Congress doesn't pass the compact legislation for these three North Pacific countries, the more precarious their financial situations will become.
Right. And you sort of mentioned it before, but is it okay if you just explain what the US is saying why it's been delayed.
You mean what's going on behind the delay?
Yeah, what's going on behind the delay?
So I don't see, for me, I don't understand why they don't simply introduce the legislation as standalone legislation. However, I am aware that there is this system in the U.S. Congress where when new money is required, they have this requirement that you have to offset it, meaning you have to take away money from some other budget lines in order to accommodate the new spending, I guess, due to the fact that the U.S. government's debt is, $1 trillion or whatever it is. So they would need a couple $1 billion. The overall agreement with the three freely associated states is set US $7.1 billion for 20 years. And apparently they need about $2.3 billion offset to move this thing through, and they can't find the money to offset it. Well, like the U.S. government also agreed to the U.S. Pacific Fisheries Treaty, which requires $60 million a year for 10 years, $600 million. Well, can it deliver on that? Well, it can't deliver on that unless the Congress approves it. So there's a lot of this U.S. policy stuff where, the U.S. says, well, we're really focused on the Pacific and we're doing things, but the Congress just can't pass legislation.